Hi everyone, welcome to the Aegeus Bowl and also to episode 76 of our weekly CRICKETher Vodcast. And we've just watched the Vipers suffer a defeat to the Southeast Stars. Sid, will you ever recover? No, but seriously, this was a top of the table clash, so potentially quite significant.
Yeah, it was. So the Stars have now put themselves in a position where if they win their last game on Monday, then they will definitely go straight through to the final, which is back here in a week's time. So they are looking in pole position, but in fact, so Lightning and Sunrisers can now no longer qualify for finals day, but everyone else still can. So we've got a really exciting day's cricket coming up on Monday. As I say, the Stars are in pole position. The Vipers, if they win their game, then they will definitely be at finals day as well. Then the other group, it's actually a lot more complicated because the other group are well down on this group in points, and because of the combined table and 3 qualifying, and it gets complicated. But join us all on Twitter on Monday. It's going to be a really exciting day. We'll be at Edgbaston Foundation Ground watching the Sparks, and we're really looking forward to it and looking forward to an exciting day's cricket.
Great, thanks Sid. Well done on your trademark table, whatever we're calling it. Good. Okay, so that's the Lottie Cup. Are we allowed to call it that? But we have an international series starting in a few days' time. England are finally going to be getting to play New Zealand. Very exciting. Obviously, New Zealand have now been in the country a couple of weeks, played a couple of warm-ups. But we heard the announcement of the England squad this week, and there are a couple of surprise additions to that squad, actually. England called up Maya Boucher and Charlie Dean. It's probably quite appropriate that we're here at the Aegeus Bowl talking about that, as they are both Southern Vipers players. Obviously didn't play today. Although we did have the news coming through kind of about halfway through this game that unfortunately both of them are now having to isolate because of coming into close contact with somebody who's tested positive for COVID. So that is a bit disappointing because it means they definitely won't play a role in the first of the 3 T20s. And Emma Lamb has been called up as a kind of replacement, a sort of COVID cover player. We'll talk about her in a minute. Let's start off with Boucher and Dean. Sid, Maya Boucher, surprised to see her in the England squad?
Ultimately, not surprised to see her in England squad. It's been obvious for a long time that she was a potential future England player. I saw her I believe I saw her second game for Middlesex when she was like 14, and was already clearly a very promising sort of natural athlete. But you know, in this game, it's not you can't just be a promising natural athlete. You have to work really hard as well, and she has worked really hard over the past sort of 5 or 6 years. She's worked hard on her fitness. She's overcome issues with her bowling. As we know, she was suspended from bowling last year because they concluded she had an illegal action. She's gone and sorted that out over the last year or so. Her bowling action has now been passed as okay, but she's really made it here on the strength of her batting. So I don't think that she'll be expected to bowl. She didn't bowl at all in the 100, even though she was allowed to. So she'll be there as a batter. Is she going to play? Well, obviously we know she's not going to play in the first game. Is she going to play in the next 2 games? There's a couple of things that could happen. England could play her batting down at 8 in both those games, and you know, just use the rest of the bowling they have. Bearing in mind that they've got Nat Siver that can send down overs as well, and Heather Knight. So that's an option. It's not one that I'd like to see though. I'd rather she only played, say, in the last game and played in much more of her natural position higher up the order and actually got a proper chance. Because if she plays 2 games batting at 8, we've seen it all before. It's what happened to Sophia Dunkley when she made her first few England appearances. It's just not a fair way to give you an opportunity to kind of step into international cricket. So I'd rather see her play just 1 game, perhaps higher up the order. What about Charlie Dean, Raff? Where does she fit in?
Yeah, another interesting example of somebody who maybe the role that we might see her playing for England isn't the one that we would have envisaged when we first saw her. So I first became aware of her a few years ago when she was a young batter. I think for Hampshire she was batting at 4 or 5, something like that. And that was the point at which Charlotte Edwards was a kind of player coach at Hampshire. She moved to Hampshire from Kent and successfully kind of brought them up from Division 3 to winning the Women's County Championship in the course of just a few seasons. A brilliant rise for them, and Charlie Dean was a really integral part of that. And I remember Lottie saying to me, Raff, she's really promising with the bat, she's going to play for England one day. But I don't think that they've necessarily brought her in as a batter. I think that based on what we saw of her in the 100, actually, the way in which London Spirit used her was much more as a bowler, and she bowled quite a lot of overs for them in the power play, and I think that happened because she got a few I've just said overs in the 100, shocking. She bowled quite a few sets of 5 for them in the power play in the 100, and I think that perhaps that even took Spirit by surprise how successful she was. But yeah, good on her. Obviously kind of decent off spinner, and that's a role, kind of somebody who is an off spinner who then can maybe bat a bit down the order in a T20, a role that England have been trying to fill for a while, and we've seen people like Maddie Villiers come in and try and do that role. They're obviously not necessarily convinced by Maddie Villiers, and perhaps are bringing Charlie Dean in to maybe take on that role and see how she gets on with it. So perhaps she might actually be more likely, before today I would have said to play in all 3 T20s. Obviously we know she's not going to be able to play in the first one, but to maybe be brought into play in the last couple of games in that role. So yeah, really interesting to see how she gets on potentially. I think that one of the things that we have to do is give credit though to Heather Knight and to Lisa Kitely for actually bringing in these couple of players, don't we? Because we've been quite critical in the Vodcast previously of kind of saying, well, England's selections are so conservative and they never bring in young players, and now they have, and we're kind of going, oh well, what role are they kind of going to play? I know, but actually good to see people given that chance to just come in and be around the squad. Now Emma Lamb, Sid. Emma Lamb obviously received a kind of late call up on the back of those kind of COVID isolation requirements for Maya Boucher and Charlie Dean. Interesting call up there.
Yeah, it's not, of course, her first call up because she did go on a tour a few years ago, but she didn't actually play a full match for England, so she's still not got a cap. But she's kind of an interesting player in this context because she's kind of a replacement for both Maia and for Charlie Dean, because she's a top order batter. So obviously opens the batting and has been, had a reasonably successful season. The very beginning of the 100 didn't go quite so well for her. She kind of lost a little bit of form, but pulled things back again late in the 100. But of course, she was an off-spin bowler, so she's got that as well. So she could potentially play the role that Charlie Dean was going to play. Interestingly, Mark Robinson always talked about Emma Lamb as a bowler who could bat a bit, despite the fact that her main role for Lancashire has always been as to hit runs at the top of the order. So that will be an interesting one, and we might see her as well.
Great. Well, we'll have to see what happens, and hopefully COVID doesn't ravage things too much. Anyway, there's also been some big news this week relating to the 100. Now the ECB have come out and they have said, only a few days after the tournament concluded, that yes, they are definitely going to retain the double header model. I believe that was actually said in a press conference. So are you surprised that they've gone down that route, Sid?
I'm not surprised they've gone down that route. I'm a little bit surprised they've announced it quite so soon. And what they've essentially said is they're going to keep that model for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, I'd have expected them to kind of have a little bit more of like think time and a bit of a review, and perhaps do some focus groups and things like that, and actually really look in detail. But they've obviously just been so impressed with the success of the model and the numbers that it's produced, because it has produced these very big numbers, as we know. That they said no, we're not just going to do it next year. We're going to do it for the next 4 or 5 years. That's the model going forwards for them, and that's the decision that they've taken. Obviously, that's not something that's going to go down terribly well in those smaller counties, however. And we did mention this. You mentioned it in the Vodcast last week, I believe. Those smaller counties, the Sussexes and things, that were promised that they would get some shout in the 100 by being able to host the women's teams. That, of course, means that that's not going to happen. What else have we heard this week? Well, we're hearing rumours not only of about 2 new teams in the 100, but they might be introducing these 2 new teams as soon as next year. I think there's certainly some logic in that. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it soon. They're talking about introducing a team so the rumours say, in Somerset and in Durham. It's quite clear from the ECB's perspective that what they're trying to do here is head off some of the remaining additional kind of opposition to the 100. They're two areas where the ECB are not particularly popular as a result of the 100 and things in general. Durham, you say the words ECB in Durham, and you perhaps have to be careful about people's reaction. And ditto in Somerset, as we've seen when we've been down to Somerset. So, but they're thinking they might be able to head off some of that opposition. Will that work? We'll see about that. But it's an interesting possibility. But Raff, 2 more teams for the women's game. Is that something that we welcome? Is that something that the women's game can cope with?
Yeah, maybe it's an interesting question to think about, and a few years ago I might have been a bit more sceptical, but I was just thinking about this on the way here, and just this week we saw Marie Kelly, who couldn't get into Birmingham Phoenix's first choice 11 in the 100, hit the most amazing 100 for Sparks in the Charlotte Edwards Cup. So good on her, and it just shows that we do have more of a depth of domestic talent than perhaps we did a few years ago. Somebody else who couldn't get a game in the 100, Grace Scrivens, who I know that you're really positive about and really see her very much as the future of England's batting, Sid. So those are a couple of possibles who might really benefit from a couple of new teams. The other thing that I think could be really interesting about a couple of new teams is that it's 6 more overseas spots in the 100. And if we don't have those 2 new teams coming in, what we get is a situation where you have a real dilemma for the franchises. Do they stick with and do they be loyal to the kind of second choice players who came this year and who came in some cases, despite lots of COVID worries? So somebody like Sammy Jo Johnson coming from Australia, for example, who was reasonably successful actually. Do you stick with her, or do you go, oh no, we're just going to replace you by Alyssa Healy, and that's fine, because and the ECB kind of encouraged that because, well, Alyssa Healy's a really big name and she'll bring in people through the gates. I mean, I think we've kind of seen that we don't necessarily need those big names in order to get people through the gates, but you know what I'm saying, it's there would be that allure of getting the bigger names versus retaining loyalty to players who came at considerable personal risk to themselves this year. Whereas if you have 2 new teams, then you to some extent alleviate that because more overseas spots become available. So I'm not necessarily negative about introducing a couple of new teams. I suppose it slightly complicates things because at the moment we've broadly got 800 teams and 8 regional women's teams that broadly are similar and based in the same places, and then that adds a level of complexity. I don't think anyone's saying that we're going to get 2 new regional teams, are they?
No.
So there's kind of arguments on both sides, but I think it could be quite interesting and exciting. Now finally this week, Sid, over in Spain, the World Cup qualifiers are being played, and there was an exciting win for Scotland. Tell us more.
Yeah, it was an exciting win. First of all, let's be clear. This isn't the World Cup qualifier. It's the qualifier for the qualifier. So if you win this, you go through to the global qualifier, and in the global qualifier, then I think 3 teams from that qualify for the actual World Cup, which is in South Africa in 2023, so it's quite a long time away. But Scotland had a win against Ireland, which almost certainly means that they will win this tournament and therefore qualify for the global qualifier, which is really exciting for them. They certainly weren't favourites to do that, but we've seen a little bit of a different Scotland this week. They at one point in this game against Ireland, they really looked kind of out of it, but some positive mindset, some positive cricket, it looks like Mark Coles is really bringing the kind of sort of the kind of ethos and the confidence that he brought to Pakistan is also being brought to Scotland. So that's an incredibly good thing for cricket in Scotland, and a wonderful win for them. And as long as they can knock off, they still need to play France and Germany, but given France and Germany's performances so far, they really ought to win those games extremely easily indeed. And in fact, we think, although we can't actually find a copy of the rules online, we think they actually only need to win one of those games in order to qualify, because they'll otherwise end up tied with Ireland, and if they're tied with Ireland, the first determinant is not net run rate, it's the head-to-head between the 2 teams. So Scotland would still go through, even if by some disaster they lost one of those games, but they really ought to absolutely thrash France and Germany.
Okay, now, quick question. I'm springing this on you slightly, but it just strikes me that Kirsty Gordon, who previously, as we know, had qualified for England at the expense of Scotland, may be tempted back into the Scottish fold by the prospect of playing a World Cup for her very much beloved home nation of Scotland. Would it be logistically possible for her to do that under the ICC regulations?
Yeah, I'm fairly sure that is the case. I think that she qualifies again this summer. She may even already actually technically be qualified again for Scotland. She hasn't played for England for 3 years now, so that would be a thing that she could do. They'd certainly love to have her back. She remains she's definitely a Scottish patriot at heart. Her heart is in Scotland. When the rugby's on, she's supporting Scotland. When the football's on, she's supporting Scotland. So I know that that's in one sense something she'd love to do, but she's also got some professional loyalties there as well. So I also understand that she feels that she'd like to kind of also really fight for her England place back. So but it would be something that would be an option.
Okay. Now, what does this mean for Ireland? Does this mean that Ireland are out of things?
Well, from what I said, you'd think this was a disaster for Ireland. It's not great for Ireland, but the good news for Ireland is, in fact, it looks like they will almost certainly still qualify for the qualifier, because the ICC have got one kind of what you might call a wild card pick or a fastest loser pick, whereby the highest ranked team that don't qualify by winning their regional qualifier will also qualify for the qualifier. That's an awful lot of qualifiers in qualifiers, but basically,
can you qualify that statement?
I can't qualify it anymore, I don't think. Ireland should still be okay. Ireland should still go through back green.
Great, thanks Sid. I think we'll wrap things up there. We better get a move on home before they come and kick us out of the Ageas Bowl. Thanks for watching as ever, and see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.